There is a moment, usually late in the evening, when the noise of the world softens and the echo of other people's opinions begins to grow louder instead of quieter. It happens in the stillness when the room is dim and the glow of unfinished ideas flickers somewhere between ambition and doubt. You may know that moment. The one where you replay conversations in your head, wondering if the hesitation in someone's voice meant they never believed in you at all. I have come to recognize that moment not as weakness but as a doorway. A quiet, almost invisible doorway where something inside asks a question that rarely has an immediate answer. What do you do when the world quietly decides you are reaching too far? I have lived many versions of that question in this imagined life of constant building, breaking, and rebuilding again. Not the dramatic versions people often assume, but the smaller, more personal ones. The moments when doubt arrives not as criticism but as silence. Silence from people you hoped would understand the vision forming inside you. Silence from people who once cheered until the road became unfamiliar to them. That kind of silence has a particular weight. It does not shout. It lingers. There is a rule I follow when that silence appears, though I did not create it consciously at first. It formed slowly, like condensation on glass, collecting from repeated nights of uncertainty. The rule is simple, but living inside it is not. When people doubt me, I do not rush to defend myself. I listen to what their doubt awakens inside me, not their words, not their expressions, but the part of me that reacts to being misunderstood. Most people believe strength is proven through louder conviction. I once thought that too. I believed clarity required explanation, and that respect required persuasion. But time has a strange way of removing decorations from truth. It strips away the performance until only something quieter remains. And in that quiet, I notice something uncomfortable. Doubt from others often mirrors doubt already living inside us. Waiting for permission to speak. I remember a long evening in a fictional workspace that smelled faintly of metal and warm circuitry, where plans were scattered across a table like unfinished thoughts. There was no audience, no applause, just the low hum of possibility and the heavier hum of uncertainty. I stared at those plans and felt the echo of voices that were not physically present but deeply familiar. Voices that asked if I was chasing illusions disguised as progress. Voices that suggested ambition can sometimes be a form of loneliness. And I asked myself something I had never asked before. If no one ever believed this could work, would I still continue? That question did not arrive as inspiration. It arrived as discomfort. Because the honest answer was not immediate. I sat with it longer than pride would normally allow. And in that stillness, I noticed the rule beginning to form. The realization that belief borrowed from others is fragile, but belief discovered alone develops a strange durability. It becomes less about proving people wrong and more about proving something true within yourself. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from trying to convince people you are not lost. It drains energy from the very work you are trying to protect. I learned that doubt, when answered too quickly, multiplies. But doubt, when observed quietly, sometimes dissolves or reveals something more valuable. Sometimes it reveals where your own uncertainty still lives, waiting to be acknowledged without judgment. You may have felt this in your own life, though it may have looked different. Perhaps it appeared in relationships where your emotional depth confused someone who preferred simplicity. Perhaps it appeared in career decisions where your intuition pointed toward a direction others called impractical. Doubt often arrives disguised as concern. And concern can feel caring even when it quietly invites you to shrink. I began noticing that the loudest reactions from others were rarely the most important ones. The ones that stayed with me were the subtle glances, the careful pauses, the well-meaning advice that carried invisible limitations. Those moments taught me that people do not always doubt your ability. Sometimes they doubt their own comfort with change. And sometimes, without meaning to, they offer you a smaller version of yourself, because it feels safer for them to understand. There is something deeply human about wanting to be understood. I have felt that pull many times, especially during imagined nights where success felt distant and the cost of persistence felt personal. But understanding from others often arrives late. Sometimes it arrives after results. Sometimes it never arrives at all. That realization can either create bitterness or create freedom. I'm still learning which path requires more courage. The rule I follow is not about ignoring doubt. Ignoring anything rarely leads to clarity. The rule is about letting doubt sit beside me without allowing it to take the steering wheel. I let it ask questions. I let it expose fears I would prefer to hide. But I do not let it rewrite the direction of the road simply because it speaks with confidence. There is a quiet strength in continuing forward without announcing every step. A strength that grows in private, where validation is replaced by alignment. I have learned that some journeys lose their integrity when explained too early. Not because they are fragile, but because they are still forming. And unfinished ideas often need protection from premature interpretation, sometimes. I wonder if people realize how much courage exists in silence. Not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of incubation. The kind where answers are allowed to mature instead of being forced into existence to satisfy immediate expectations. That silence has guided me more than any applause ever could, yet there is still a question that returns to me during those long reflective evenings. How do you know when doubt is a warning meant to protect you, and when it is simply fear wearing a logical disguise? That question does not resolve easily. It lingers, changing shape as experience grows. I have noticed that the difference often reveals itself through patience. Warnings grow clearer over time. Fear grows louder. But recognizing which voice you are hearing requires something most people avoid. Stillness long enough to hear your own thoughts without interruption, and perhaps that is where this story truly begins. Not with success or failure, not with achievement or loss, but with the uncomfortable companionship of uncertainty. Because the rule I followed did not protect me from doubt. It changed my relationship with it. And what that relationship eventually revealed would reshape not only how I work, but how I love, trust, and remain present in moments where certainty refuses to exist. There is another layer to this rule, one that does not reveal itself quickly. It has less to do with ambition and more to do with identity. But understanding that layer requires revisiting a memory I rarely speak about, even in imagined reflections. A memory that quietly explains why doubt from others can sometimes feel heavier than it should, and why learning to carry that weight changed everything. There is a memory that returns when the night becomes too quiet, when the mind begins revisiting the early rooms where identity was still forming and confidence felt more like borrowed clothing than something naturally worn. It is not a dramatic memory. It is soft, almost ordinary. But it carries the same emotional echo that appears whenever doubt from others begins to settle into the background of my thoughts. And perhaps you have your own version of this memory. The first time you realized that being misunderstood can feel more isolating than being alone. In that imagined season of my life, long before any symbolic achievements or external recognition, I found myself fascinated with ideas that most people around me did not know how to hold. Not because they lacked intelligence or kindness, but because unfamiliar ideas often create emotional distance. I remember speaking with quiet excitement about possibilities that felt alive inside my mind, only to notice the subtle shift in conversation. The polite nods, the redirected topics. The gentle suggestion that I might be thinking too far ahead. At the time, I interpreted those reactions as personal rejection. I assumed that if people did not share my excitement, it meant something was flawed within me. That assumption planted a quiet habit. A habit of measuring my worth through the level of comfort others felt around my thoughts. It is a dangerous habit, though it disguises itself as humility. It teaches you to shrink your language, soften your vision, and eventually question the legitimacy of your own curiosity. I carried that habit longer than I realized. It followed me into relationships, collaborations, and even solitary moments where no one else was present, yet their imagined reactions still influenced my confidence. I began noticing that doubt from others did not hurt because it blocked progress. It hurt because it triggered an older fear. The fear that being fully honest about what moves you internally might lead to emotional distance from people you care about. There is a quiet grief hidden inside that fear. The grief of realizing that authenticity sometimes rearranges relationships, not through conflict, but through misalignment. And misalignment rarely announces itself loudly. It shows up as conversations that feel slightly off rhythm, as encouragement that feels supportive but strangely detached, as admiration that exists but only within boundaries that do not fully include who you are becoming. I once asked myself during another long imagined evening whether success would solve that misalignment. Would achievement translate unfamiliar ideas into accepted ones? Would results create retroactive understanding? The thought was comforting but incomplete. Because even when people eventually understand what you create, they do not always understand what it cost emotionally to continue creating. When understanding was absent, that realization shifted something in me. It made me question whether the real challenge was external doubt or internal permission. Permission to remain loyal to curiosity, even when it complicates connection. Permission to allow people to misunderstand parts of you without interpreting that misunderstanding as rejection. That is not an easy permission to grant yourself. It requires releasing the quiet hope that everyone you value will walk beside every version of you. There is a moment many people encounter, though they rarely describe it openly. The moment you realize growth is not always a shared journey. Sometimes it is a solitary expansion that others observe from a distance, unsure how to participate. That distance can feel like loss even when no one has actually left. And when doubt enters during that distance, it can feel like confirmation that the path you are walking is separating you from belonging itself. I remember sitting with that fear longer than comfort would normally allow. I allowed myself to imagine walking away from difficult visions simply to maintain emotional closeness with people who preferred stability over exploration. It was a seductive thought. Stability carries warmth. Predictability carries acceptance. But every time I imagined choosing that path, something inside me grew quieter. Not calmer, quieter, as if a part of my identity was slowly dimming its own light to avoid, creating shadows for others. That was when another layer of the rule began revealing itself. When people doubt me, the question is not whether they are right or wrong. The question is whether abandoning my direction would create peace or create a different kind of internal absence. And I learned that internal absence is far heavier than external misunderstanding. It is the kind of weight that does not announce itself immediately. It accumulates slowly, turning enthusiasm into obligation and curiosity into routine. You may recognize that transformation. The subtle moment when something you once loved begins feeling like something you perform. When your voice begins sounding slightly rehearsed, even in private thoughts. That transformation rarely comes from failure. It often comes from prolonged self-betrayal disguised as practicality. There is an honesty that arrives when you sit quietly long enough to notice which decisions make you feel more alive internally, regardless of how they appear externally. That honesty does not eliminate fear. It simply clarifies which fears are worth carrying. Some fears protect comfort. Others protect authenticity. Learning the difference has been one of the most delicate emotional skills I have ever tried to develop, and I am still learning it. Sometimes I wonder how many people abandon extraordinary parts of themselves, not because they lack courage, but because they misunderstand the emotional cost of staying true to what calls them forward. Courage is often portrayed as dramatic action, but I have found it lives more often in sustained patience. In continuing to listen to a quiet inner voice that does not compete well with louder, more socially acceptable opinions. Yet another question remained unresolved in those reflective nights. If remaining loyal to your internal direction sometimes creates emotional distance from others, how do you protect your capacity to love without resentment? How do you continue building connection without expecting others to fully understand your path? That question lingered beside me like a companion I had not yet learned how to speak with, because the truth is, doubt from others does not only challenge ambition, it challenges intimacy. It challenges whether you can remain emotionally open while walking a road others cannot fully see. And discovering how to hold both connection and independence without sacrificing either became the next evolution of the quiet rule I follow. That evolution did not arrive through achievement or validation. It arrived through something far more unexpected. It arrived through failure. Not public failure, but deeply personal failure. The kind that reveals how you treat yourself when your own expectations begin doubting you more loudly than anyone else ever could. And what that failure revealed would reshape not only how I respond to doubt from others, but how I respond to disappointment within myself. Failure has a quieter voice than people imagine. It does not always arrive as collapse or a visible loss. Sometimes it arrives as a slow realization that something you believed would fulfill you has left an unexpected emptiness behind. That realization tends to surface during moments when celebration fades and you are left alone with your own reflection, wondering why accomplishment did not translate into the emotional clarity you anticipated. I remember an imagined period like that when progress existed on the outside, yet internally something felt unresolved. And perhaps you have known that feeling too, the strange loneliness that can appear even when everything seems to be working. At first, I resisted acknowledging that emptiness. I treated it as exhaustion or temporary confusion. I told myself that forward momentum would eventually dissolve it. But emptiness is patient. It waits in silence, allowing distractions to pass until it can be felt without interruption. And when I finally allowed myself to sit with it, I discovered something unsettling. My fear of failure had quietly shaped many of my decisions. Even when I believed I was acting from confidence. It is easy to think fear only appears when things go wrong. But fear can also disguise itself as relentless productivity, as constant movement, as the refusal to pause long enough to ask whether you are building something meaningful or simply building something impressive. That distinction became painfully clear during one imagined night where the environment around me was filled with symbols of achievement. Yet I felt disconnected from the very excitement that once drove me forward. I asked myself a question that I had avoided for years. If success does not silence doubt, then what is it actually meant to create? That question changed the atmosphere inside my thoughts, because it exposed a truth I had not been ready to face. Success does not eliminate insecurity. It magnifies whatever relationship you already have with yourself. If you trust your direction, success deepens that trust. If you secretly question your worth, success can make that question louder. Because now you fear losing what you have built. During that period, my own expectations began doubting me more intensely than any external critic ever could. I replayed decisions, wondering whether I had followed genuine inspiration or simply chased outcomes that validated my identity. The pressure of maintaining progress became heavier than the original effort required to begin. And I realized something that unsettled me deeply. I had learned how to continue moving forward, but I had not learned how to remain emotionally present while doing it. There is a particular kind of failure that occurs when you succeed externally but disconnect internally. It is subtle. It does not collapse structures or erase achievements. It quietly removes the emotional meaning that once made effort feel alive. That failure forced me to revisit the quiet rule I follow when people doubt me. Because now the doubt was coming from inside, and the rule had to evolve or become irrelevant. I began observing how I responded to my own disappointment. Not dramatic disappointment, but the smaller, recurring realization that I was human enough to misjudge timing, overestimate endurance, or misunderstand what truly mattered in certain moments. And I noticed a harshness in my internal dialogue that I would never allow towards someone I cared about. That harshness revealed an uncomfortable pattern. I had learned to tolerate doubt from others, but I had not learned to forgive doubt within myself. That discovery reshaped everything, because it made me realize that the quiet rule was incomplete. Listening to doubt without allowing it to control direction was only the first step. The second step required learning how to listen without punishment. Doubt, whether internal or external, often carries information, but punishment silences information. It replaces curiosity with fear, and fear rarely produces clarity. You may have felt that same pattern. The moment you make a mistake and immediately reduce your entire identity to that single misstep, the moment you measure your worth through outcomes instead of intentions, that emotional reflex is incredibly common, yet rarely spoken about with honesty. We celebrate resilience publicly, but privately, many people maintain impossible expectations of their own consistency. There was an imagined morning when I looked at a series of unfinished plans and felt an unfamiliar calm instead of frustration. That calm did not come from certainty about success. It came from accepting that uncertainty is not evidence of incompetence. It is evidence of exploration. And exploration, by its nature, requires tolerating incomplete answers for extended periods of time. Asterisk. I realized that my greatest fear had never been failure itself. It had been the emotional isolation I associated with failing, the belief that mistakes would separate me from respect, belonging, or love. But as I sat with that fear, I noticed something quietly reassuring. The people who truly valued presence and honesty were not measuring me through perfection. They were measuring me through authenticity. And authenticity often becomes clearer through imperfection than through flawless execution. That realization softened something inside me. It allowed the quiet rule to deepen into something more compassionate. When doubt appears, whether from others or from within, I no longer treat it as an enemy or a judge. I treat it as a signal asking me to slow down and listen carefully to what part of me is seeking reassurance or recalibration. Yet another unresolved question began forming during that stage of reflection. If you learn to coexist with doubt instead of fighting it, does that make you stronger or more vulnerable? And if vulnerability becomes part of strength, how do you protect it in a world that often rewards certainty more than honesty? That question lingered during many reflective evenings. Because vulnerability, when misunderstood, can feel like exposure without protection. But vulnerability, when held with quiet confidence, can become something entirely different. It can become clarity that does not need performance. I began noticing how the most meaningful connections in my imagined life were not built through demonstrations of capability, but through moments of genuine emotional presence. Moments where uncertainty was not hidden but acknowledged without surrendering direction. Those moments carried a depth that achievement alone never created. Still, learning to balance vulnerability with quiet strength remained incomplete. I sensed there was another dimension waiting to be understood. A dimension connected not to ambition or failure, but to love itself. Not romanticized love, but mature love. The kind that exists between individuals who allow each other to grow without demanding constant reassurance, and somewhere within that realization, I began to understand that the quiet rule I follow when people doubt me was preparing me for something far more personal than success or resilience. It was preparing me to understand how to remain emotionally present with others while staying loyal to my own evolving identity, but discovering how doubt influences love. That would require confronting a truth I once avoided entirely. There is a quiet moment that often arrives after you begin understanding your relationship with doubt. A moment where you start noticing how those same patterns appear inside love. Not the early excitement of connection, but the deeper, steadier layers that form when admiration softens into familiarity. I have returned to this realization many times, usually when reflecting on how easily people celebrate growth and ambition, yet feel unsettled by growth and identity. It made me wonder whether doubt becomes more complicated when it comes from someone who genuinely cares about you, someone whose presence feels intertwined with your emotional safety. In one imagined chapter of my life, I experienced a connection that felt calm, intelligent, and deeply respectful. There was no chaos, no dramatic instability, only a gentle rhythm of shared curiosity. Yet, even within that harmony, I noticed subtle moments when my evolving direction created quiet uncertainty between us. Not disagreement, not rejection, just hesitation. And hesitation, when it appears in someone you value, can feel heavier than open conflict. Conflict invites clarity. Hesitation invites interpretation, and interpretation can quietly awaken insecurities you believed you had already outgrown. I remember noticing how I began adjusting my language, simplifying complex thoughts, trying to translate internal visions into something easier to hold. At first, it felt like consideration, but slowly it began feeling like self-editing. That distinction became emotionally significant. There is a delicate difference between communicating with care and diluting authenticity to preserve comfort. Recognizing that difference is one of the most challenging emotional skills I have ever tried to develop, because both come from a desire to maintain connection, yet only one preserves emotional truth. There was an evening where silence sat between us. Not uncomfortable, but thoughtful. I sensed questions in her presence that were never spoken aloud. Questions about stability, about sustainability, about whether a mind constantly reaching forward could remain emotionally available in the present. And I realized those were fair questions. Ambition can sometimes create distance if it becomes louder than presence. That realization forced me to ask myself something quietly unsettling. Can you build extraordinary visions without unintentionally creating emotional absence for someone who simply wants to feel seen beside you? That question stayed with me longer than pride would prefer, because it revealed that the quiet rule I follow when people doubt me cannot exist in isolation from love. Listening to doubt internally is one thing. Listening to doubt from someone whose emotional well-being matters to you requires a different level of patience. It requires separating protective concern from limiting fear without dismissing either too quickly. And that balance is fragile. If you lean too far toward independence, connection suffers. If you lean too far toward reassurance, identity begins dissolving quietly beneath accommodation. I began realizing that mature love is not built on perfect understanding. It is built on mutual respect for internal journeys that cannot always be shared step by step. That realization felt both comforting and painful. Comforting because it removed the impossible expectation that love must eliminate all misunderstanding. Painful because it revealed that emotional closeness sometimes requires allowing space where full understanding does not exist. That space can feel like distance if it is not held with trust. And trust is rarely built through explanation alone. It is built through consistency of presence over time. There was a moment when I chose not to defend my direction, not because I lacked confidence, but because I trusted that clarity would reveal itself through lived experience rather than persuasive conversation. That choice felt risky. Silence can be interpreted as uncertainty, but I sensed that defending every step would transform love into negotiation instead of companionship. And companionship, at its healthiest, allows two people to evolve without constant justification. That understanding deepened the quiet rule into something more relational. When doubt appears in love, I listen not only to what is being questioned, but to what is being protected emotionally. I noticed that her hesitation was not rooted in disbelief of my capability. It was rooted in a fear of losing emotional accessibility. That distinction changed how I responded. Instead of proving my direction, I focused on proving my presence. Not through promises, but through small, consistent attentiveness. Because I have learned that people rarely fear ambition itself. They fear becoming secondary to it. And presence, when offered sincerely, reassures without requiring compromise of identity. It creates an emotional bridge where growth can occur without abandonment of connection. Still, another layer of vulnerability revealed itself. I realized that offering presence while pursuing demanding visions requires emotional discipline that is rarely discussed. It requires noticing when your mind begins living exclusively in future outcomes while your heart quietly waits in the present moment. That discipline cannot be forced. It must be practiced through deliberate stillness, through moments where productivity pauses long enough to acknowledge the emotional atmosphere between two people. Those pauses often feel inefficient, yet they create the stability that allows ambition and love to coexist without silent resentment. You may have experienced relationships where someone loved your potential but struggled with your evolution. Or perhaps you were the one struggling to understand someone else's transformation. Those experiences rarely end through dramatic endings. They often dissolve through gradual emotional misalignment. I have learned that preventing that misalignment requires honesty delivered with softness, not defensiveness. It requires acknowledging that love is not responsible for making your path easier, and your path is not responsible for making love simpler. Both are responsible for remaining genuine. There were nights when I questioned whether sustaining both vision and deep connection was realistically possible. The weight of that question felt personal, almost existential. Because if growth demands solitude and love demands availability, how does one human heart hold both without fracture? I have not discovered a permanent answer. But I have discovered that refusing to choose between them forces you to evolve emotionally in ways that neither ambition nor love could achieve alone. That evolution is uncomfortable, yet profoundly human, and as I continued reflecting on that balance, another realization began forming quietly beneath my awareness. The quiet rule I follow when people doubt me had guided my ambition, strengthened my resilience, and reshaped my understanding of love. But there remained one final dimension I had not fully explored. The dimension connected to legacy, not in terms of achievement, but in terms of emotional imprint. The question of what remains inside others after they experience your presence, your silence, your persistence, and your vulnerability. Because eventually, doubt from others fades into something less significant than the memory you leave behind and how you treated yourself and those who walked beside you. And understanding that final dimension would require confronting the most personal question of all. What it truly means to live in alignment when the world is no longer watching. There is a quieter kind of reflection that appears when you begin thinking about what remains after effort, after ambition, after relationships have shaped and reshaped who you are. It is not a reflection about achievements or recognition. It is something softer, almost invisible. The reflection about the emotional atmosphere you leave behind in rooms you once occupied, in conversations that seemed ordinary, in silences that carried more meaning than words ever could. I have come to believe that legacy is rarely defined by what we build externally. It is defined by what others remember feeling when they stood close to the truth of who we were becoming. I return often to the quiet rule I follow when people doubt me, because it has revealed something deeper than resilience. It has revealed alignment. Alignment between who I am privately and who I allow the world to see gradually without performance. And that alignment has reshaped how I understand presence. Not as availability to everyone, but as authenticity offered without fragmentation. There was a time when I believed presence meant being constantly accessible, constantly explaining, constantly reassuring. Now I understand presence as emotional steadiness. The ability to remain whole even when understanding is incomplete. I have imagined future evenings where the noise of creation fades, where the urgency of proving ideas gives way to the quiet responsibility of understanding impact. And in those imagined moments, I do not find myself replaying victories or defeats. I find myself wondering whether I honored the internal voice that guided me when external opinions grew louder. Because I have learned that self-respect grows from loyalty to that voice, especially during seasons when it speaks without confirmation. There is a particular memory that often surfaces during these reflections. A moment where someone once told me, not with admiration but with calm sincerity, that my greatest strength was not persistence or intelligence. It was consistency of character. At the time, I did not fully understand what that meant. I assumed they were describing reliability in work or communication. But over time, I realized they were describing something far more fragile. The ability to remain emotionally recognizable to those who care about you. Even as you evolve, that realization deepened my understanding of the quiet rule. When people doubt me, I am not simply protecting ambition. I am protecting the integrity of my emotional identity. Because every time we abandon our direction to avoid discomfort, we risk becoming unfamiliar to ourselves. And unfamiliarity within one's own identity creates a loneliness that success, relationships, or admiration cannot easily resolve. You may have felt moments where you adjusted your dreams, your voice, or your emotional truth to maintain harmony around you. That instinct is deeply human. Belonging is one of the most powerful emotional forces we experience. But belonging that requires self-erasure eventually transforms into performance. And performance, when sustained too long, creates exhaustion that feels like emptiness without explanation. I have learned that quiet strength is not measured by how firmly you hold your direction. It is measured by how gently you hold yourself while walking it. Strength without gentleness becomes rigidity. Gentleness without strength becomes uncertainty. But when both exist together, something rare forms. A steadiness that allows you to listen to doubt, love without possession, and grow without abandoning connection. There is a question that has followed me through every stage of this reflection, a question that never fully disappears. What does it mean to be enough even when your life is defined by constant reaching towards something beyond your current understanding? That question once felt contradictory. How can you feel complete while pursuing expansion? But I have begun sensing that completeness is not the absence of desire. It is the absence of self-rejection during desire. It is allowing yourself to want more without believing you are less. During long imagined nights of reflection, I sometimes picture the younger version of myself who believed validation would eventually silence uncertainty. I feel compassion for that version because he did not yet understand that uncertainty is not an enemy to be defeated. It is a companion that evolves alongside growth. The quiet rule I followed did not remove uncertainty from my life. It transformed uncertainty into dialogue instead of conflict. There is a calm that appears when you stop expecting the world to confirm your worth before you feel allowed to continue. That calm is not arrogance. It is acceptance. Acceptance that your path may confuse some people, inspire others, and remain invisible to many. And none of those reactions define the legitimacy of your internal calling. Legitimacy is felt, not granted. I often wonder how many people are standing at the edge of decisions that could transform their lives, quietly waiting for reassurance that may never arrive. Waiting for universal understanding before allowing themselves to move forward. If I could speak to them without instruction, only reflection, I would simply share this awareness. Doubt will never disappear completely, but it does not need to disappear for clarity to exist. Clarity grows when you listen patiently enough to recognize which doubts are echoes of fear and which are invitations toward deeper honesty. And as I sit within this final reflection, I notice how the quiet rule has become less about responding to doubt and more about cultivating presence. Presence with ambition, presence with love, presence with imperfection, presence with the fragile, beautiful unpredictability of being human. That presence has taught me that fulfillment is rarely found in arriving somewhere permanent. It is found in walking forward without abandoning yourself along the way. There is one final image that remains with me, one that returns during evenings when reflection feels heavier than usual. I imagine standing in a dimly lit room filled with unfinished ideas, old memories, and the quiet echoes of voices that once questioned my direction. And instead of feeling pressure to silence those echoes, I feel gratitude for them. Because they forced me to listen more carefully to the voice that never shouted, never demanded attention, but remained patiently present within me, that voice. The one shaped by honesty, restraint, vulnerability, and quiet courage, has become the only compass I trust completely. Not because it guarantees success or approval, but because it keeps me aligned with the person I am willing to live with when the world grows silent. And perhaps the quiet rule I follow has never been about how to respond when people doubt me. Perhaps it has always been about learning how to remain steady enough to hear myself clearly, even when uncertainty refuses to leave.